Orwellian Ambitions. This opinion argues Orwell's 1984 remains relevant as states weaponize information and silence dissent. It is a sad reality that George Orwell's novel 1984, published in 1949, is still relevant in the current dystopian global environment in which authoritarian states have created their own ministries of truth, ironically named for not safeguarding the truth but destroying it to protect the interests of the ruling elite in Big Brother. Dystopian is an adjective which means an imagined society that is deeply unpleasant or frightening, often oppressive. Authoritarian is an adjective which means favoring or enforcing strict obedience to authority at the expense of personal freedom. Ministries of truth is a figure of speech which means government bodies that control or rewrite information to serve state propaganda. Big Brother is a figure of speech which means an intrusive authority that watches and controls people's lives. Ruling elite is a noun which means a small group that holds disproportionate political and economic power. This opening sentence serves as a thesis statement by asserting that modern regimes mimic Orwellian information control to protect elites. The result is intellectual stultification and what Nobel laureate Czesław Miłosz called a logocracy, or a society where the narrative is manipulated to fit the regime's propaganda. Logocracy is jargon, which means rule by controlling and manipulating public narratives. This sentence says, narrative control deadens thought and becomes a governing system. Troublesome people, inconvenient facts, and awkward aspects of journalistic probe must be removed from public life. Removed from public life is idiomatic expression, which means silenced or excluded from public discussion. This sentence claims dissenting voices and facts are being suppressed. In such dispensations, the deep state calls the shots. Calls the shots is idiomatic expression, which means exercises control or makes decisions. This sentence means hidden power structures are directing events. After years of watching Pakistan suffocate under the weight of its democratic collapse, I have come to understand what former U.S. Ambassador to Hungary David Pressman felt. Suffocate under the weight of its democratic collapse is hyperbole, which means an exaggerated description of severe democratic decline, though this sentence expresses the author's view of deep democratic deterioration. He said that the real danger of a strong man isn't his tactics, it's how others, especially those with power, justify their acquiescence. Acquiescence is noun which means passive acceptance or submission. This quote argues elites' passive acceptance empowers strong men more than their tactics. A pliant silence prevails in the corridors of power. Pliant silence is a metaphor, which means submissive quietness among officials. This sentence says officials are silently complicit. Some even rue the fact that our democracy is too fragile to withstand a strong man. Rue is verb, which means to regret or feel sorrow about. This sentence notes some lament democracy's weakness against authoritarianism. Institutions like parliament, the judiciary, bureaucracy, and police have capitulated, tacitly admitting that they cannot maintain their independence or stay above the fray. Capitulated is verb, which means surrendered or yielded under pressure. This sentence accuses institutions of surrendering their independence. Even a large section of the media, which is supposed to hold the government to account, has fallen silent. Fallen silent is phrasal verb, which means stop speaking out or criticizing. This sentence says the media is not fulfilling its watchdog role. Many politicians, including former self-identified defenders of civilian supremacy, are skirting their moral responsibility to take a stand in support of democratic principles. Skirting is verb, which means avoiding or evading. This sentence accuses politicians of dodging their duty to defend democracy. Some have even aligned themselves with and praised the hybrid governance paradigm. Hybrid governance paradigm is jargon, which means a mixed system combining civilian and military elements. This sentence warns some officials endorse a semi-authoritarian model. Unfortunately, it is a self-aggrandizing myth and a potent tool of self-deception. Self-aggrandizing myth is figure of speech, which means an inflated, self-serving narrative used to justify power. Anyatum, this sentence critiques rhetoric that normalizes hybrid rule. Metaphorically, they could not outfox the fox and have ended up welcoming it to their henhouse. Outfox the fox is idiomatic expression, which means try to outsmart a cunning opponent and fail. This sentence says attempts to outmaneuver the strong man failed and made matters worse. They think it is a savvy strategy of appeasement. Appeasement is noun, which means conciliatory policy of giving in to demands. This sentence says they mistake submission for smart strategy. They are mistaken. Mistaken is adjective, which means wrong in judgment or belief. This sentence bluntly rejects the appeasement view. History has the unsavory habit of repeating itself. Repeating itself is idiomatic expression, which means similar events recur over time. This sentence warns past mistakes often reoccur. Subjugation can eventually result in humiliation. Subjugation is noun, which means domination or oppression of people. This sentence warns oppression leads to public disgrace and resentment. The Black Coat Revolution stood defeated the day the bold stance of a few judges of the Islamabad High Court, IHC, against the machinations of the powers that be was not supported by their seniors in the apex court, and lawyers, by and large, chose the path of least resistance. Black Coat Revolution is metaphor, which means judicial activism by judges in robes. This sentence argues the judiciary movement failed when higher courts and lawyers did not back courageous judges. That choice, unfortunately, strengthened the autocratic state machinery that uses fear to suppress dissent. Autocratic state machinery is jargon, which means institutions and apparatus enforcing authoritarian rule. This sentence says the decision empowered authoritarian institutions to silence critics. This is the climate of menace that prevails. Climate of menace is metaphor, which means an atmosphere dominated by threats and fear. This sentence summarizes the pervasive intimidation in society. Now that we have celebrated the 78th anniversary of our independence, it is high time we reflected upon the follies of our successive military and civilian rulers and decided to choose the harder right instead of the easier wrong. Choose the harder right instead of the easier wrong is idiomatic expression, which means opt for morally difficult but correct actions rather than easy wrong ones. This sentence urges moral courage in governance. The harder right is never easy. Harder right is idiomatic expression, which means the more difficult but morally correct choice. This sentence repeats the call for choosing difficult moral action. Balochistan is a case in point. Case in point is idiomatic expression, which means an example that illustrates the point. This sentence introduces Balochistan as an illustrative example. Last year, after my annual visit to Quetta, I had written an article for this paper on August 24th, asserting that the state was fast losing its writ over vast swaths of its ungoverned areas, and that Dr. Marang Balok had captured the imagination of the Balok youth who felt alienated and ignored by both the federal and provincial governments. Losing its writ is idiomatic expression, which means losing effective authority and control. This sentence recalls the author's past warning about state losing control in Balochistan. It was time to genuinely redress their grievances related to the issue of missing persons and grant them their political, social, and economic rights, creating, above all, a sense of ownership in the future of Pakistan as a federation. Redress is verb, which means remedy or make amends for grievances. This sentence recommends legal and political remedies to restore trust. That write-up proved to be a cry in the wilderness. Cry in the wilderness is idiomatic expression, which means a warning or plea ignored by others. This sentence laments that previous warnings went unheeded. No one in the corridors of power took notice. Corridors of power is idiomatic expression, which means those who hold political authority. This sentence says leaders ignored the warnings. It is high time we made a decision to choose the harder right instead of the easier wrong. High time is idiomatic expression, which means it is overdue to act. This sentence repeats the call for urgent moral choices. Last month, I visited Quetta again and came back deeply disappointed and disillusioned as the situation in the province is utterly bleak and despondent. Bleak and despondent is adjective, which means hopeless and depressed in outlook. This sentence conveys the author's deep disappointment with provincial conditions. The security agencies have detained Balok women activists, including Marang and a few of her companions. Detained is verb, which means arrested or held by authorities. This sentence reports activists have been taken into custody. While I was there, she was produced in the anti-terrorism court, Quetta, for extension of her physical custody. Produced in court is phrasal verb, which means brought before a judge for proceedings or custody review. This sentence notes formal court procedures were used to extend her remand. She addressed the judge calmly and, with a smirk, asked him to announce the decision as dictated to him by the powers that be. Powers that be is idiomatic expression, which means those currently in authority. This sentence suggests decisions are controlled by those in power rather than by law. She accepted her further custodial remand and calmly walked away. Custodial remand is a technical term, which means continued detention ordered by a court pending investigation or trial. This sentence reports she was kept in custody again. Her sister, along with some other young activists of the Balak Yageti Committee, BYC, are yet again in Islamabad, seeking justice and suitable legal remedies to the issue of missing persons. Seeking justice is idiomatic expression, which means pursuing legal redress and accountability. This sentence says activists are pursuing legal solutions in the capital. The state has resorted to the ultimate insult to the Balak Code of Honor by showing disrespect and detaining their daughters. Code of Honor is noun, which means a set of cultural norms governing honor and respect. This sentence argues detentions deeply offend local cultural values. This kind of indignity evokes deep anger and disaffection against the state. Disaffection is noun, which means feelings of dissatisfaction and alienation from authority. This sentence links indignity to rising resentment toward the state. It could have been avoided. Could have been avoided is idiomatic expression, which means the harm was preventable. This sentence says the harm was unnecessary and could have been prevented. What is the result? Public transport is not allowed to ply at night on the vast road network of the province as the threat of militant attacks is so great. Ply at night is phrasal verb, which means operate services during nighttime hours. This sentence describes severe restrictions on travel due to security risks. Even daytime travel for pilgrims going to Iran and Iraq has been discontinued by road. Discontinued is verb, which means stopped or suspended. This sentence notes pilgrim road travel has been halted. My sentiments stand endorsed by a recent HRCP fact-finding report on Balochistan's crisis of trust. Fact-finding report is jargon, which means an official investigation document summarizing findings. This sentence cites an independent report validating the author's concerns. In the light of its findings, 13 key recommendations have been made to the state to address the human rights, governance, and political challenges currently facing Balochistan. Recommendations is noun, which means suggested actions or policy measures. This sentence says the report offered concrete policy suggestions. While all the recommendations are important, the following need urgent attention. Urgent attention is idiomatic expression, which means require immediate focus and action. This sentence signals priority items among the report's suggestions. 1. Demilitarize the province and create conditions conducive to meaningful dialogue with all genuine political stakeholders to rebuild public trust. Demilitarize the province is jargon, which means reduce military presence and return control to civilian authorities. This recommendation calls for removing soldiers to enable political dialogue. Reconciliation was a key point of the Counterterrorism National Action Plan, originally launched in 2015 and reinforced in 2021. Reconciliation is noun, which means restoring relations and resolving grievances through dialogue. This sentence recalls earlier plans emphasizing political reconciliation. While relentless kinetic measures may be taken against proscribed militant organizations like the BLA, including the Majid Brigade and BRA and BLF, the government must undertake constructive engagement with the BYC that represents the angry Balak youth. Kinetic measures is jargon, which means military actions or use of force. This sentence argues force should be paired with political engagement. They should not be deprived of their political, social, economic, and legal rights. Deprived of is phrasal verb, which means denied access to or possession of. This sentence insists rights must be restored to affected people. 2. Immediately cease the practice of enforced disappearances. Enforced disappearances is technical term, which means state-sponsored abductions where victims are secretly detained without legal process. This sentence urgently calls for ending secret detentions. The issue of the missing persons must be resolved in the light of recommendations made by the IHC-designated commission headed by Akhtar Mengel. IHC-designated commission is jargon, which means a panel appointed by the Islamabad High Court to investigate specific issues. This sentence urges following the court-designated inquiry's guidance. A constitutional and legal framework under ATA 1997 is a viable way to heal this festering wound in the province's body politic. ATA 1997 is technical term, which means the Anti-Terrorism Act, enacted in 1997, governing counterterrorism law. This sentence suggests legal reform under existing legislation to address abuses. 3. Ensure transparency, fairness, and accountability in all electoral processes. Transparency, fairness, and accountability is jargon, which means openness, impartiality, and responsibility in governance. This recommendation calls for credible elections to restore trust. Only a legitimate and truly representative government can earn the trust of the public and deal effectively with militancy. Legitimate and truly representative is adjective phrase, which means elected government reflecting the population's diversity. This sentence links political legitimacy to effective counterinsurgency. 4. End reliance on paramilitary forces for civilian law enforcement. Paramilitary forces is jargon, which means armed units that are not regular military but used for internal security. This recommendation urges returning civilian policing to accountable police services. Highly professional, accountable, and rights-compliant policing is critical to gaining public trust. Rights-compliant policing is jargon, which means law enforcement that respects human rights and legal standards. This sentence calls for professional policing that protects rights. Above all, give respect to the bailiff. They may break, but will not bend. They may break, but will not bend is figure of speech, which means they may suffer hardship, but will not surrender their principles. This concluding line appeals for respect and warns of resilient resistance. The writer is former Inspector General of Balochistan Police. Published in Dawn, August 15, 2025.